So welcome to QG Connect, where we interview industry leaders on their perspectives around data governance. My name is Bharat, and I'm really excited today to welcome our guest. So Tejasvi Addagada is the data governance head and data protection lead at Axis Bank. Welcome to QG Connect, Tej.
Thanks for having me here, Bharat. And this initiative, in fact, is quite interesting from DataQG. Looking forward to further nudges from yourself.
Absolutely, Tej. Great to have you with us today, and really looking forward to sort of digging into this area a little bit with your help. So, to help us get us started, Tej, I was wondering whether you could tell us about your current role at Axis Bank.
Well, this has been quite a journey for me. I started in Axis around 4 years ago. In fact, I was the first person who, in fact, started a formal data governance function within the information technology division, that is IT. Just got to build a team of 30 over the past 4 years, managing quality of data, along with having to manage vocabulary and metadata, data architecture, as well as central data operations, the CDO, and specifically the aspects around master data and reference data management. When I look back at the journey of an Indian bank, where I myself had to, kickstart or start up something fresh, such as a formal data governance division, and where I stand today, it has been quite a journey, I would say.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think this field is sort of kind of evolving really fast, and I'd love to get your perspective on how you've sort of seen this whole area around data governance evolving the last few years and where you see it going, Tej. But before we get there, I was wondering whether, if you take a step back and look at what made you want to get into this data governance area in the first place, could you maybe talk about that a little bit?
I have been into business analysis with Infosys Consulting. And even before that, I worked on legacy technology, that is mainframes of the world. And, I found a need to move into business analysis given that there was a focus required on better managing the requirements. And from there, I got into data analysis because I saw a specific need within the industry in terms of having to actively manage data as well as the related capabilities. And, I stumbled upon one of the first data offices, which in fact wanted to be formalized within a global bank. And I started putting in a technology operating model as well as a business operating model for a tier 1 data office. And from there on, I have been in multiple firms, some of the Fortune 50s, helping them stand up their data offices, helping them mature from whatever levels they were at in terms of defining their processes and making them sustainable. But when I look back 4 years ago, I thought, why not pick up something like an Indian bank? And India, in fact, is still nurturing its data management capabilities because India is more focused on skill sets that are IT related. And platform management is, in fact, a major skill set that is found around here. And my idea was around having to pick that up and extend it into, a formalized aspect of managing it, which in fact means that, that's data governance for me, as well as for, the organization. So having to formalize data management and putting in guardrails, directing them, assessing them, and having to monitor them, specifically for the purpose of, again, providing guidance. That's data governance to me. And in fact, I think I was able to steer the organizations, and that's a sweet spot for me as well.
No, I think that sort of perspective that you mentioned at the beginning of your career from the consulting side, I'm sure that's, and your current role now, I'm sure that combination really gives you sort of different perspectives around how organizations are building their programs from scratch. And I think, like you said, India is sort of early on in that process of sort of building these practices and frameworks. I mean, I was wondering whether we could double click into one of the points you had mentioned. I mean, in your mind, how would you define data governance to, let's say, someone who's not as familiar with this particular term?
Well, I would say data governance with the common analogy. Um, I'll take this popular analogy which I use for quite some years, and in fact, that is something which I give my readers of the book. Um, Perhaps in the early 1800s, there were horses which, in fact, were transferring customers or people from London to Farrington. It's not a large stretch of journey, but at the outset, having horses, in fact, made it easy for people to travel. And someone out there thought that they need to commoditize this particular journey of people and transferring people. And they got in drivers, perhaps the chauffeurs, who in fact, or house riders, however you would want to call them. And in fact, they felt that they had everything in place, but at the outset, whenever it was bad weather, or whenever in fact the roads were not quite amicable to travel, there in fact needed to be certain guidance given to the horse carts. And this is where certain guideposts were arranged between London to Farrington, for this particular company to service the horse carts. Maybe it can be feeding the horses in between, having to maintain the particular carts if a wheel is broken, or perhaps some maintenance that is required, and also to advise the chauffeurs or the car drivers in terms of having to steer clear of any robbery. At the outset, there is also a risk they need to avert, right? So I will transfer this analogy back to data management and governance. While the horse carts, in fact, are a specific means of having to transport the customers from specific spaces or places to another specific place. However, the guideposts that have been established during the journey, in fact, are synonymous to data governance or aspects of data governance. What they try to do is they assess, and they in fact see what is the kind of assistance that is required to the horse carts. In this particular analogy, it's horse carts, but it is data managers as well as platform managers. And on having certain insights, the data governance function, which in fact is a guidepost here, will guide the data managers in terms of having to take a specific path, in terms of having to reach that particular outcome. And that's an analogy which popularly I use. And I hope that's simple enough.
No, it definitely is, and really love that analogy. I think it's a very unique analogy that I haven't come across before. But it makes a lot of sense because you want, I mean, these drivers, or let's say the business, to operate on its own. And how do you put those frameworks and those guidelines or those guideposts, like you were talking about it? So I really love how you can sort of look at it from both those perspectives. And I think, like, I mean, a lot of people at least used to think of data governance as something that maybe limits the business in terms of all these practices and sort of these frameworks that you need to put into place. But really, you're trying to just facilitate like business, make them move faster, but at the same time, from a regulatory perspective, from making sure that the business is relying on the right data. From that perspective, you're just facilitating that. So I really love how that analogy sort of brings everything together. And if you I mean, if you think back to your consulting day stage, or even now, I'm wondering whether you can talk about, maybe for organizations who are looking to build like a data governance program from scratch, what are maybe some of the guided steps that they can undertake to get to the point where they're showing that value to the business. So I was wondering whether you can shed some light there.
Yeah, sure. I think going back from our analogy, in terms of what data governance is, now that we made it simple about what is data management, and what we do by managing data, we actually provide data for reporting or analytical insights or regular operations. And at the outset, any organization, be it a startup or be it a large bank, in fact, needs to process data to, in fact, provide an outcome. It can be something like giving away a loan to a customer, but deciding on having to underwrite the loan. Or it can be as simple as, giving away a particular product on Amazon or an e-commerce website and having to service the customers. But all of this requires lots of data crunching. And specifically, when it comes to managing data for a specific purpose and a process that is involved in having to process it, it becomes more important for us to ensure that data across these processes is in fact consistent. It's as simple as today most of the organizations might be looking at an example of a product code of 44, which actually means perhaps a mic, which is of particular make and brand. But this particular product code of 44, when it gets into a warehouse, it can mean a camera. It's about how we bring in consistency across what data means to anyone across the organization. And specifically going back to the question, I think if someone would want to start on having to consistently manage data for their context, for quality, as well as to produce better outcomes with efficiency, and that's where they need to start actively governing it. And by actively governing it, what I mean to say is it'll be much challenging to actually pick up the entire landscape. So let's say you are a CEO of the firm, Bharat, and you might bring in perhaps hundreds of people together to manage data in one go. But it'll be quite challenging to invest so much into a program upfront. So it's always better to break this up into chewable chunks that can be easily managed and governed. And that's where my advice would be having to understand, if you are into a risk-based business like banking, with a regulator who in fact guides you around the business policy, or are you taking a benefits-based approach in terms of you are more pro towards revenue generation? And this will in fact help you guide yourself towards a defensive approach if you are in fact into a risk taking business or a risk driven business. Or you could take an offensive approach if you're not into a regulator controlled business. So that'll be the first step to in fact strategizing data management and governance. And the next suggestion I would have is how do we break this entire landscape into chewable chunks? One thing is, people have started talking about a data mesh. I think it's a buzzword around, and it's all about having to manage data as domains and the associated platforms as domains. But within the data governance industry, we have been talking about this for quite some years. You would want to pick up something like marketing, which in fact is perhaps a revenue generating function or enables revenue generation, and having to scope up the data like a customer name or an email address or something like a contactability information where a customer or a lead can be reached to, and then having to actively manage and govern that particular set of data, making it qualitative, making it easy to understand, and then architecting it well. So this will be my second suggestion to having to manage a larger landscape with ease without having to burden an organization with a complete force of having to manage all the data around. I hope that in fact is helpful.
No, it certainly is. And I love that aspect around maybe picking the areas where you can show the most impact, whether it's those defensive or offensive approaches that you talked about. And as someone who works in the marketing area, I can definitely vouch for the fact that data is really key in terms of how we drive those marketing campaigns and how to really measure the efficacy of those campaigns. So I think your example of picking marketing as maybe that more of an offensive minded approach, that really resonated with me. So I just wanted to say that. Uh, I think no, that's certainly great advice. I think uh, for organizations who are looking to start a program, they can sort of pick which of those areas they want to focus on. And I was wondering whether, coming from that kind of from an IT background and currently in your role, I was wondering whether you can talk about how data architecture impacts like data governance, because I know there's a lot of buzzwords out there right now. There's a lot of environments that organizations have to deal with, whether it's on-prem, hybrid, or multi-cloud environments. So I was wondering whether you can talk about how that data architecture impacts these organizations who are trying to build their programs from scratch.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. In fact, it's a very broad question, but at the outset, I'll try to pick up certain aspects of data architecture. Yeah, well, coming from an IT background, specifically what intrigued me earlier into financial service consulting is something like how can an information architecture as a discipline can assist organization in terms of making data interoperable, making platforms interoperable, so that it becomes nimble to generate certain outcomes or indirectly monetize data. And that's where when I talk about information architecture, usually I refer to two components. One is the data architecture, and the other is the technology architecture. And specifically, when we talk about data governance per se, we pick up a component of information architecture, which is data architecture, and technology architecture, which is other component, is majorly managed by the IT within organizations. And the data architecture component will require specific ownership from business, from the perspective of having to put a common understanding to data as well as its characteristics. So it can be as simple as how do we define a nominee name while we collect the data? Is it a mandatory field? What does it really mean? Is a nominee a participant in a transaction? And the response which a data collection you know representative would in fact be quite different from someone who is towards the end of the data lifecycle, who might be closing an account or having to perform certain transaction as a beneficiary for a nominee. And if we ask someone who is closing an account, we can clearly come to understand that a nominee can perhaps be a participant in the transaction. So this is a common example which I try to use in terms of having to state that the data architecture would in fact include this component of building a common semantic definition of data across the life cycle. And this is where even the earlier aspect of how do we manage data in specific data domains and data sets by simplifying the entire landscape into chewable chunks. So that is another aspect of data architecture, along with having to building the business vocabulary, which in fact can be picked up by data officers in terms of having to manage this particular component of information architecture better. And what happens if we get to govern data architecture is that there are specifically certain benefits of having to actively govern data architecture. It can be through an architectural committee with specific checkpoints. And I can name 5 specific benefits because I myself take a benefits-based approach rather than taking a risk-based approach to architecture. Because we run this particular discipline most often from the first line of defense rather than the second line of defense. The first benefit, which in fact I can quote, is that by managing architecture and governing it, you will be increasing the efficiency of your scoping activities that are performed on data during strategizing a change, maybe picking up a digital channel or releasing a digital product that might be very new to the market, which might include enterprise analysis. And the second benefit, which I would quote, is the effort and the person hours that are in fact spent on analyzing the business requirements. And after having to analyze the business requirements, having to elicit the data requirements in a formalized way is in fact much easier if you have to manage your data architecture as a discipline, because you'll know how to connect your dots between business requirements and the data requirements and the platform requirements, as well as business policy and rules much better. And the third benefit, which I would quote, is there is specifically a communication overhead when it comes to having to translate the backlogs or requirements into a working product. And when you get to manage the architecture in an active way or an active fashion, you get to define the common vocabulary that is being used in your requirement space. And this common understanding, in fact, will reduce on the communication overhead. And coming to the fourth benefit, as you increase awareness around, how data is defined, how in fact, data architecture defines certain realms of technology implementation of platforms or pipelines, it actually gives awareness and a common understanding of how data in fact is being used for impact analysis. You get to know how it is being consumed down in a data lake or far right into a data warehouse. So the impact analysis, the lineage and the provenance makes it much easier even for the consumers to trickle this awareness that perhaps we discussed in the earlier benefit. So these are 5 benefits which I commonly use to put across a benefits-based approach. Usually my suggestion is to refrain from having to drive this with a risk-based approach, even though there might be some who would prefer to have certain checkpoints put from the second line of defense. But gradually, I think it'll be more preferable to embed this within the fabric of the organization.
Yeah, love that, Tej. I think that benefits-based approach also allows you to sort of show the value of these programs in a faster manner than more of a risk-based approach, which in many cases it's hard to quantify because it's a benefit of not having done something. So I definitely see the value that you mentioned in taking that kind of an approach. And I mean, that's sort of a great overview, I think, of how sort of the different ways in which you can take these different approaches. I think one thing I'd also love to get your perspective of about is you've been in this area for a while. It's a very fast moving or evolving area. I was wondering whether you could also maybe put on your thinking cap and look at it maybe 3 to 5 years down the road. How do you see this whole area around governance and data management evolving, maybe let's say over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a great question, but you might get different perspectives, Bharat, from each of us out there in the industry. Well, having to speak to some of my peers in the industry, like yourself and perhaps Phil, as well as some of my peers in the banking space, what I can quote is that the digital transformation as well as the digital journeys of customers are in fact transforming the way we are doing business today. More probably because we would want that comfort of having to transact from homes rather than having to physically be present there. And however, this is one specific trend which in fact makes it more important for us to actively manage and govern data. Because the number of channels on an average for an organization, which perhaps is making certain billions in revenue, have increased in the past 2 years from perhaps 30 channels to 80 channels, which can be indirect channels or the previous native direct channels. So we are looking at a massive jump in the number of ways customers are being onboarded and serviced, which in fact means that data collection, which was overlooked in the past few years, is in fact one of the specific domains that is gaining importance today. And there is one other trend that is catching up. We can see that there is protection policies that in fact are changing, perhaps in the Europe, or we are looking at some new policy coming up in Asia. Like in India, we have a PDPB coming up, which in fact are more actively looking to have data, personal data, actively managed and governed, along with the accuracy of it. Uh, though it's a risk-based approach that the policy provides to organizations as guidance, but nevertheless, the focus is on data collection, and it's going to be data collection for the next few years. Um, though data consumption always had its own importance, I think the focus, as I see, will be shifting to data collection. And that is something which I have been experiencing myself. And apart from that, one of the other trend is data democratization. As we talked about data architecture, which is a component of information architecture, and then having to build a common vocabulary that you and I speak, or someone else speaks about, something like a customer name or a customer address. Having to harmonize this particular meaning, and having to have any data consumer within an organization search for it, like how do we do a Google search or a Bing search or a Yahoo search. uh, this is one of the aspects that in fact is picking up as a trend, because the more we democratize data within organizations, the more easy is it for someone to consume it, be it self-service or be it a assisted service or a full service of having to manage something like a report or a data model. So this is one of the trends, but you can also see that in the market or in the industry, we can see a myriad of data catalogs that are spurring up. We can look at data catalogs, or something like data discovery solutions, which take a privacy view to it. So this in fact is a dipstick check for us to state that there in fact is a demand that is picking up for democratization and having to manage the vocabulary of business terms. So these are two trends which specifically I would want to stress on. While the aspects of quality as well as architecture will stay still as ivory. They are there and they'll be still there. They'll be stressed on by policies around the world, and it'll be governed by a risk-based approach.
No, that's a great sort of a forward-thinking view, and I think if I can add to your point, Tej, I think this is a great time to get into data governance because of all of the drivers that you were just talking about in terms of increased data coming through these different channels, and that sort of brings to the forefront the critical nature of data governance and how it ties to these different initiatives. So I really love the points you brought up. I think we can go on, to be honest, but I think we are running short a little bit on time. I wanted to also say that you've been one of our biggest champions since we launched. So I wanted to thank you personally for that. And I know, apart from work, there's a lot of other things that you're currently engaged on. You're a prolific author, for example. So for people who are trying to reach you or get in touch, what would be the best way you'd recommend?
Well, it has been a pleasure having to work with yourself and Phil on DataQG. You have been, in fact, great promoters of the community, giving away benefits in terms of guidance to the organizations. I think we would still look up to you as community members in terms of giving this guidance across a common guidance, and having to promote conversations around a specific topic, or certain trends that in fact can be realized by organizations. Thank you for that. That's one important thing which I wanted to talk about. And coming to the next aspect, well, I think yeah, there is a book out there which I published in 2017. It's Data Management and Governance Services: Simple and Effective Approaches. It also includes some of my travel diaries. So since I was in California, I lived in UK, I lived in Sydney, lived in Vietnam. I got to put in some of my journeys, which in fact makes it more amusing for the readers to go through the complete challenges when I took them up from the start. And the book is available on Amazon. While anyone who is interested in having to converse with me can actually drop me a note on LinkedIn or Twitter, and I'm sure that I'll be responding within a day or a week's time if in fact I'm delayed. So looking forward to further connects, and yeah, over to you.
No, thanks a lot, Tej. I'd love to, personally speaking, understand your perspectives as you've sort of traveled through these different places. But that's probably a conversation for our next session. So again, I wanted to thank you again. It's been a really great conversation. I enjoyed it a lot. And I'm sure our listeners got a lot of value out of it as well. Thanks a lot, Tej.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for having me. And yeah, let's talk again.
Sure thing. Thank you.